Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about all sorts of stuff, including how we tried to turn our role playing game into a comic book, the changes we had to make to the game so that we wouldn't get sued, how that failed, and how we ended up undoing those changes later and how the villain who would make all of that happen would be an amalgam of Darkseid and Thanos, who we named Nihilist, and how we decided that Y2K would be ground zero for him altering the timeline. But before we get into all of that, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. We've got an awesome community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. So, as I mentioned in previous episodes of this podcast, starting in 1992, we began what was basically this big countdown, which culminated in a big game that I ran on August 29th of 1997 that was based on the Crisis on Infinite Earths, as well as a Marvel event called Onslaught and a DC event called Genesis. And I felt a lot of pressure to make that big game worth it. I didn't want to tease the thing for half a decade and then have it be anticlimactic. So I was under a lot of pressure. And thankfully, my players loved the big game. So after it was over in September of 1997, it was a huge weight off of my shoulders. But then I wasn't really sure what to do with myself. I was kind of in neutral, and we were running a thing that dealt with the gods of various pantheons all interacting with each other. So the stuff that I was running at the time was very cosmic. That's where my head was at back then. And around that time, I started thinking more and more about turning the game into a comic. And in 1998, I was done with art school. And that was the whole reason I went to art school, was to try to share these stories. And I just felt like I needed to get it in gear. But there was a problem. We were famous for having both DC and Marvel characters running around in the game. And of course, DC Comics and Marvel Comics would surely sue me if their characters appeared in my comic books. So at first, I wasn't really sure how to handle that. And my favorite games, which were the ones that I really was the most excited about sharing with people, were the ones that Jay Mora had ran in high school. So I reached out to Jay, whose VMPC in the early 90s was a character named Shadowstorm. By 98, Jay's tour of duty in the Army was finally over, and he got a job in Maryland working for Games Workshop, who are the guys who make Warhammer. So he was in a gaming mood again. And I reached out to Ryan Miller, who had played Torch in the early 90s. And 98 is when Ryan graduated from college and had moved home to our hometown. And now he was receptive to the idea of gaming again, too. And the guys I had been playing with in college all graduated and kind of went their own ways for the most part. So getting the high school gang back together again sounded really cool to me. So the first thing I did was I asked the guys if I could use their characters in the comic. But Jay felt weird about it. He felt like he owned the name Shadowstorm, even though I actually helped him come up with it. And we based it on Storm Shadow from G.I. Joe. But I digress. And then also, up until then, anytime I would draw Shadowstorm, I actually drew him to kind of look like Jay. And Jay didn't really want that in the comic either. So I started to rework the character. And I had a faceless Shadowstorm then, with a kind of a Deadpool thing going on. Actually, a better example than Deadpool would be Moon Knight. I basically had him look like Moon Knight. And I started trying to come up with a different name for him, since Jay didn't want me to call him Shadowstorm. And since I had been playing the old World of Darkness games by White Wolf, I was familiar with a realm from Werewolf the Apocalypse called the Umbra. So I thought Umbra would be a cool name for the new Shadowstorm, and Jay loved it too. And as a Transformers fan, I was familiar with how Megatron became Galvatron and how Bumblebee became Goldbug. I had just been acclimated to this notion that after a while, a character might somehow evolve into a bigger, badder version of themselves. And so that started to be what I wanted the comic to be about. And since I was changing Jay's character, we decided that we should change Ryan's character too, from Torch to Pulsar. So what had been kind of a flame motif on the Torch costume got upgraded to this sort of star-like pattern on the Pulsar suit, because a star was the hottest version of fire that I could think of, and it just seemed more cosmic. And speaking of things going cosmic, what I was doing with the characters was a lot like how Norrin Rad became the Silver Surfer. In his case, the catalyst for the change was Galactus, right? So I wanted Shadowstorm and Torch to experience something that would cause these upgrades. So I decided I needed a villain. And the villain part was kind of the easiest part. I thought of Darkseid as the biggest DC villain of all time, and his counterpart at Marvel would be Thanos. So I just made an amalgam of them. And by the way, this is around the time of the whole Marvel versus DC event in comics when they made amalgam comics. So Thanos side would have been fresh in my mind at the time. And so the Thanos part of that equation got me to thinking about the Infinity Gauntlet. So I also made knockoffs of the Infinity Gems that instead of being like kind of a smooth egg shaped gemstone, mine were these long, sharp crystal shards growing in a mysterious cave. And the idea was that Shadowstorm and Torch would enter the cave, which in my mind would be inspired by Disney's Aladdin, with the Cave of Wonders, where Aladdin found the genie's lamp. And just like in the movie, there would be like danger and traps, etc. But in the end, they would find these crystals. And so one would represent time, and that would be one that I would give to Torch. So when he was upgraded to Pulsar, he would have mastery over time and ideas like speed and stuff like that. And another crystal would represent space. And when Shadowstorm obtained that one, it would upgrade him to Umbra, and it would give him cosmic levels of teleportation, as well as some new powers like dimension travel and even the ability to phase out, kind of like Kitty Pryde, making him ghost-like and creepy, which I thought was a really good fit for that specific character. And since Shadowstorm had lightning as well, I came up with another crystal that represented the broader concept of electromagnetism. So then Umbra would be able to do anything involving that spectrum of power as well. And of course, just the same, Pulsar would need to have fire as hot as the sun now, so I'd give him a crystal associated with the element of fire. And just as Thanos obtained the Infinity Gauntlet and became a problem, we would have Nihilist do something similar, so that he was the equal opposite of the boys, and he'd get his hands on some new time and space powers as well. And what better to tell a story about time and altering time and stuff like that than the turn of the millennium, right? So before I talk about what actually happened in the game, I want to put all of this in perspective. While we did turn the boys into Pulsar and Umbra, and we did run a ton of games around Y2K, and they were epic and they were cosmic in scale and they were very, very well received. What we did not actually manage to do is make the comic book. I tried, and I could talk about the various problems I ran into, but at the end of the day, I guess in terms of what this podcast is about, the specifics probably don't matter to most people. Suffice it to say, though, the project fell through. And as far as the game goes, we wanted to kind of get back on track and get back to doing things the way we had been doing them when we weren't sweeping the DC and Marvel characters under the rug. So what that meant was that, yes, Nihilist did exist, and yes, he did tamper with the space-time continuum on Y2K, but at the end of the day, most of what he had done was fairly promptly undone. So I just want everybody to understand that going in. Okay, so what basically happens is Nihilist gets his hand on these crystals that give him mastery of time and space. And if you remember what happened in Zero Hour, where Parallax wanted to kind of unmake the universe and then he was going to start it up again, but he was going to kind of sculpt it and control, what happened with it. Well, so that is sort of what Nihilist did, the first half of it, anyways, right? His whole motivation, as his name implies, was that he wanted to destroy, right? So he didn't want to remake the universe. He just wanted to destroy. And he did. And so we get to this point in the story where the game world just does not exist, right? It's just a void of nothingness. And so our trio of heroes, who are now Umbra, Master of Space, Pulsar, Master of Time, and John Redbridge, who, by the way, the crystal he got was power. I kind of based on the power gem. So that was more kind of along the lines of like strength and body and stuff like that. At any rate, they're all inside of this really small spaceship that was inspired by the Defiant from Deep Space Nine. And so the heroes pool their powers so that around their ship, there is this, it's kind of like a force field, right? And so inside of the force field, things exist. But outside of the force field, it's like nothing exists anymore. So they have a confab and they combine their abilities in between the three of them. And now they are, legit cosmic beings in the Marvel sense of the word, right? They redo the universe, And the idea was supposed to be that when they did it, and this is sort of the second half of the 0 hour idea, the thing that Parallax wanted to do, that's what they're actually doing, basically. But the idea is that it would be sort of like sculpted by their memories. But the thing is, they don't know everything, so they get the details wrong. And so instead of DC and Marvel characters that I could get sued for using if we had put it in a comic book, we made an analog for each character. So, for instance, instead of Superman, we made an original character named Ultraman. Instead of Batman, we had the Wraith. Instead of Spider-Man, we had the Cockroach. Instead of the Hulk, we had Mr. Hyde. And simply put, we said that everything that ever happened in our game world still happened. So that when I was going to draw this as a comic book, I was still going to pretty much draw all the characters like you would expect them to look. I was just going to color everything in differently. So to use Ultraman as my example, we were going to give him blue boots and then yellow legs, blue trunks, red belt, a yellow shirt, blue cape, and then like a red shield, like a medieval shield kind of a thing on the chest with a blue stylized letter U inside of it. And then we were going to give him blonde hair. And so we're going to, pretty much follow that formula with all of the Marvel and DC stuff. So that, for instance, when you have a character like Powerhouse and he looks up to Superman, now, Powerhouse grew up, and Ultraman was his role model. That was the whole reason we were doing all that. And needless to say, whereas the characters we were ripping off needed recolored and renamed and stuff like that, obviously our own original characters were going to stay the same, and they were going to be the stars of this comic book. And that first comic would have been all about them restarting their universe, and then afterwards it was going to follow Pulsar and Umbra as they adjust to these new superpowers. They figure out what powers they have, how to make them work, so on and so forth. But like I say, it all fell through. And I really wanted to do this. Like, I started drawing the comic in 1998. We wanted to publish it in 1999 in time for Y2K. And like I say, I didn't. So when that date came and went, and after a while it became clear that it was never going to happen, we ended up then running a game in the comic book store that I bought where we basically flipped that light switch right back. So that instead of a universe full of knockoffs, it was back to the way it was. And if we ran an adventure where Ultraman fought Mr. Hyde, then after we flipped the light switch, so to speak, then Superman remembered fighting the Hulk. So everybody kind of remembered the events from that time period, right? I hope that makes sense. If not, let me know in the comments section and I'll try to do a better job of explaining it. Okay, so that is basically the first half of the whole nihilist Y2K thing. Here's the other half. So, like I mentioned in earlier episodes, John Redbridge had been involved in some adventures that were inspired by White Wolf's Old World of Darkness, where Cain from the Bible was the first of the masquerade style vampires. And to make a long story short, John Redbridge killed Cain. And back then, I did not know anything about the Bible whatsoever, right? And we had a very diverse range of players over the years. And, some of them were atheists and some of them were Wiccan and, some of them were Christian. We didn't really talk about that stuff. All we would talk about was like movies and music and stuff like that back then. And so my point is that some of the guys who were Christian told me that in Genesis 4 verse 15, it says that anybody who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. So I think that wording can be kind of confusing. I think there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's confusing. But what we ended up going with was this idea that John Redbridge should not have actually killed Cain, right? That was kind of off limits. And that as punishment for doing that, he now had this fate in front of him that he had to die 7 times. And we used to play GURPS Supers back then, and they have an advantage called Resurrection, which simply put means as long as there is a chunk of John Redbridge left over, that chunk will regrow into a new Redbridge with all the memories of the original. So we gave him that. And we said that Nihilist killed John Redbridge on Y2K, but he got better. And this was actually that character's second death, by the way. Prior to this, he fought Magog several times. And on one of those occasions, Magog managed to kill him. We also said Magog killing him stripped him of his changeling powers, which are also from White Wolf. And that is why when he had the Infinity Gauntlet, he had to restore his powers with it, which I did mention in an earlier video. And that might have confused some listeners because I'd mentioned in the 80s that Dagger had restored his powers, and then I forgot to do a video about that time he died. So yeah, that wouldn't make sense otherwise, but yeah, that was how we did it. And so while John Redbridge has resurrection, were still consequences that happened when he died. And aside from losing his powers, it begged the question that if these painful deaths were punishments from God, right? Then what happens when he dies that seventh time? Does he get better or does he stay dead? So I thought that was interesting. And when John Redbridge had the Infinity Gauntlet, he also undid the split power, which is the power that Multiple Man has in Marvel and Triplicate Girl has in DC, where one character can split into many identical characters. So at one point in the game, we had like a zillion John Redbridges all running around, leading separate lives, marrying separate women. But then, thanks to those Infinity Gauntlet adventures, he undid the split power, and then he was just one guy who was still married to all those women, right? So he had a harem suddenly, which some people hated and some people loved, right? Partially because it was off the beaten path. It wasn't the same old, right? And John Redbridge was in many ways a Superman analog, but he was willing to do things like tear off an enemy's head or throw a supervillain into the sun. So in a way, Redbridge had certain things in common with characters like Homelander from The Boys or Omni-Man from Invincible years before those other characters existed. So Redbridge had fans in our circle of gamers. Not everybody, but he had a lot of fans. And at the comic book store that I bought, we ended up painting a mural of him on the wall and sold t-shirts of his chest symbol, and both were very popular. I was never able to keep those t-shirts in stock. And weirdly enough, I even found one at one point at another comic book store in Columbus, Ohio. And to this day, we have no idea how they got their hands on one to sell it. But at any rate, so the players who liked him started wanting to play his kids. And since he was Dagda, we started to think along the lines of an old comic book concept called the Twilight of the Gods, where not only does it deal with kids of famous superheroes, but also an idea along the lines of a royal family, as well as superheroes who are doing things they shouldn't be doing. And for sure, to be very, very clear, at this point in our timeline, John Redbridge is doing a ton of stuff he should not be doing. So don't mistake that, okay? Anyways, so years later, I would greenlight a game where everybody played an analog of the Teen Titans, but they were all Redbridge's kids. So in that one, the mothers of these kids were Beast Girl, Cyborg 2, Raven, and Starfire. And for those kids to be adventuring age when we played that game, it meant that they had to be born around the year 2000, which is when all this harem stuff is going on. And it's because we undid it later, right? But that is when it was happening. And we are at that time we were trying to turn all the world's superheroes kind of into a pantheon of gods. We were playing around with these ideas of mythology. And like, for instance, if you're familiar with Zeus, because I feel like way more people are familiar with Zeus than they are with Dagda, right? Think of all the kids Zeus fathered, right? That's kind of what we were doing here, basically. You know, that's what we were inspired by. And a lot of these female characters who would need to be the mothers for certain kids to exist hadn't actually been invented in comic books yet. So we used Nihilist's thing where he was messing with time as an excuse to bring various female characters back to that era. Another thing worth mentioning is that we would also use that moment as an excuse to bring in multiples of characters from alternate timelines as well. So, for instance, my wife grew up on X-Men Evolution and wanted to play the girls from that continuity. So we said that Nihilist had brought them to our mainstream continuity. So then we had, for instance, two versions of Rogue. One wore the classic green and yellow Jim Lee costume, while the other Rogue was more of a goth girl like she was on X-Men Evolution. Again, this was so that players could play the versions of characters they wanted to play, whether we're talking about the mom or the Redbridge kids, right? I should also probably mention that having multiple choices when it came to harem girls then meant that whichever version of the character did join the harem, we said that was a version who would have been into that sort of thing. So, as always, this was explicitly stated to be a consensual thing. We'd never do otherwise. I've had a couple people kind of yell at me over the years because they, got something else in their head. That's not the case. So any girl that was in the harem wanted to be in the harem. And the way we looked at it was there would be infinite possible timelines and infinite possible variants of each character. So we would use whichever one was the most into it. I remember a conversation that we had with our many, many female players from back in the day. And at that time, I remember a lot of them saying that they, the player, would go for it if John Redbridge was real, partially because he was very rich. He had matter manipulation and transmutation, so that he could just make things like gold and stuff at will. Um, he could crush coal into diamonds with his super strength. So there are a lot of girls I've met over the years that are really attracted to just the idea of knowing they're going to be taken care of, knowing they're never going to be, they have to live without, or they don't know, if they can pay the rent or have food on the table or whatever. That security is a big draw. And then, um, he's also literally the Celtic god of love slash fertility slash sex. So not only was he literally supernaturally handsome, because like in GURPS, they have an appearance we gave him called transcendent. So the most handsome human being in the world, it maxes out at very handsome. Transcendent is beyond that, right? So the character is supposed to be better looking than anybody in Hollywood. But then on top of that, they really liked the idea that he could make them very happy in the bedroom, right? To a cosmic degree. Morrigan from Celtic mythology was more or less a supervillain who wanted to destroy the earth every May Day, right? And he satisfied her to the point that she was basically just a happy, purring little kitten. And the female characters, or I'm sorry, I meant to say players, the female players wondered what that must be like. And then there's the fact that he would give them powerful children who would never grow old, maybe never die. And for that matter, he would take care of the harem girls, and they would have access to things like the Fountain of Youth. So then maybe they would never die. And so the players were all in favor of this. They were like, no, no, it makes total sense. So plenty of female players over the years would literally create a hot chick, and then as the instant she starts playing, she would hit on John Redbridge. Right? He was not an instigator. When Dan Bilzerian became famous, I had a ton of old players tag me in posts about him. Uh he reminded them a lot of Redbridge. They thought he looked a lot like Dagda, he acted a lot like Dagda. He even had a yacht which reminded of them of Dagda's ship, the USS Nemeton. But I'm kind of off topic. Getting back to Y2K and Nihilist screwing with time, we also use that as a moment for bringing in characters from other points in time and space, like the characters from My Hero Academia or Overwatch, where both stories were set in some future era, but someone wanted to play one of their kids. which left us with a lot of spare characters. And this is a bit of a downer, but we killed off a lot of people because DC had this big event called Blackest Night, which was more or less about like zombie lanterns. And in our version, we combined that with a Marvel event called Marvel Zombies. And that whole thing got really out of hand because in the comics, the heroes do what they do oftentimes because the writer gave them plot armor. But in our game, nobody has plot armor. So our Blackest Night / Marvel Zombies event pretty much killed any heroes left in our game world, clearing the board for those kids that I mentioned who sort of become the next generation. Anyways, I'll talk more about that later. For now, I think I've already hit you with an awful lot of information in this one, so I'm going to wrap it up. As always, thank you guys so much for being here. If you'd like to support our channel, you know the drill. Smash like, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. From everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.